With Israel becoming the unchallenged regional military power, a growing chorus of right-wing Israeli figures and those aligned with the settler movement have not only called for the Al-Aqsa to be seized, but also for the immediate construction of a third temple on top of the ruins of the Dome of the Rock. Prophecies of the end times emboldens these fanatics. They believe the Jewish Messiah can only come if the third temple is rebuilt, and for that to happen, Israel must be accepted in the region. A red heifer needs to be sacrificed in the Holy Land, and Israel to be declared a Jewish state. What's not helping the situation is some Arabs are normalizing ties with Israel. It further emboldens Third Temple Israeli fanatics. Now that the monarchies of the Persian Gulf have publicly outed their long-standing close relationship with Israel's apartheid government, Israel will make moves to declare construction of their third temple. Arabs of the Persian Gulf have built love and friendship with Israel over their hatred for Iran and contempt for the Palestinian people. But will this romance last forever? Most of the mainstream media tries to make normalization between Israel and the Arabs look peaceful. But remember, the force behind Israel, which is the Antichrist, has a PhD in deception. In reality, the so-called normalization process only emboldens Israel, gives power to it, and only benefits Israel for their own political and religious gains, not the Arabs. Also, any sort of make-believe peace will not last for too long. It's in the Bible, and they're using the Holy Bible as a script to bless Israel with power. They refer to this as the 7-year tribulations. The Bible talks about a peace treaty between Israel and the Arabs, and many Zionists today believe the peace treaty is all a part of the normalization process we're witnessing today. The Bible says the Antichrist strengthens during the 7-year tribulation, and then all those who signed peace treaties with Israel suddenly turn against it. Thankfully, not all Arabs have signed treaties with Israel, and many Muslims detest the idea of forming ties, especially due to the brutal oppression of the Palestinian people by the apartheid entity.
انتقلنا إلى التصهين العربي لما احنا نشوفوا دولة عربية في ظرف وجيز بعد مرحلة الطبيعة. الآن هي مرحلة التصهين، عندما نرى الدولة العربية يصبح الممارسات الصهيونية وهذا التوسع والتمدد الصهيوني داخل تلك الدول، حتى أصبح الممارسات العقدية التلمودية الفن ذلك تلك الدولة اندمج مع الفن الصهيوني، المسرح، الغناء، الإعلام. هذا ليس تطبيع.
The Arabs who haven't signed treaties with Israel, for instance, the Yemenis, the Syrians, Algerians and so on, are on the right track. Because Israel will soon behave like the United States in the region by establishing bases in the Arab world and changing regimes whenever it suits them. It's all about absolute power, absolute control and authority over the Arab and Muslim nations. I say this because it's already happening.
In April 2019, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan stopped following orders and began calling the shots. The man who'd long been one of Omar al-Bashir's reliable generals was now telling him to bring his 3 decades in power to an end. After Bashir's overthrow, Burhan was sworn in as Sudan's interim leader and was tasked with chairing the Joint Military-Civilian Council to steer the country towards democracy. But now he's dissolved the council, becoming the de facto head of Sudan.
ستتولى إدارة شؤون البلاد حتى موعد الانتخابات حكومة من كفاءات وطنية مستغلة يراعى في تشكيل هياكلها.
General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan led his second military coup in Sudan. He detained Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and his wife and all the civilian members of the cabinet and the Sovereignty Council and declared a state of emergency. The coup happened suddenly and I believe it was pre-planned. What's interesting is that the coup coincided with a visit by Jeffrey Feltman, the US Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. If you don't know who Feltman is, let me tell you. He is the granddad of Zionism, a staunch supporter of Israel, and he literally mapped and planned the war in Syria.
And since that time, our European friends have joined us in sanctioning the Central Bank of Syria, impeding the financing of the regime's brutal crackdown.
He's also behind the so-called Deal of the Century, which I refer to as the Steal of the Century, which proposes a state for the Palestinians. However, it's literally blots of scattered land and not a good deal at all. Feltman is also behind the destabilization of Lebanon, and he regularly conspires against Hezbollah to weaken and eventually to defeat it. So Israel does not have any resistance in the region at all. And surprise, surprise, Feltman was in Sudan when the coup took place. It was Burhan who normalized relations with the Israelis. It was Burhan who turned the great Sudanese army into slave fighters in Yemen for Saudi Arabia. He's not fit to lead the people of Sudan. The people of Sudan have always stood with courage in the camp of resistance, and they will stand once again. And let the incidents in Sudan be a warning to the Arab regimes who are thinking of normalizing ties, because deception doesn't last for too long. The glorious Quran speaks, when truth is hurled against falsehood, falsehood perishes, for falsehood is by nature bound to perish. The curse of normalization will continue to haunt Jenderal Burhan and his mafia. The Sudanese people will not give up nor submit, and they will not be intimidated by American threats to halt financial aid. They are determined to get their country back, and they will remain true to their country's legacy of resistance, whatever the sacrifice. Every Arab state that has gone down the path of normalizing ties with Israel has paid a heavy price and has become poorer and more crisis-ridden. It might be all glitz and glamour in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain for now, but soon Israel will start asking more, and if these regimes refuse, Mossad will certainly start planting puppets and causing political turmoil.